there to all of my absolutely fantastic 306 students. I hope this video finds you well and that you guys had a wonderful weekend. Unfortunately, like I mentioned in my announcement, I had a medical issue come up that needed to be resolved today. So I couldn't hold class in person, but I did want to go ahead and cover some content with you in this video so that we wouldn't be held up and that you guys would still be able to participate in your courses, even though I'm not there in person. So this video is kind of going to pick up where we left off, talking about the reasons why we need a science of psychology as opposed to maybe a branch of the humanities or a soft science. Like some people like to describe psychology in that way, and it's fundamentally inaccurate. So we'll talk about why that is. So basically the plan for today is for you to watch this video and take notes like you would if you were in person, if we were together in Willard Science Center. And just if you have any questions about any of the content, feel free to email me or text me your questions. And continue working on your plagiarism and APA tutorials if you haven't finished those up yet. And we will continue class on Wednesday. Okay, so yeah, let's get right into it. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so we are ready to go here. Okay, so first let's review a little bit of what we talked about last time, right? So again, the overarching theme of this lecture, of this first kind of series of ideas, is motivating why we need the scientific method to study psychology. And really the reason is that we can't trust our intuition, right? We're prone to validate truthiness, right? This idea that things that seem like they're probably true, right, are things that seem like they could be true, such as we all learn uniquely and tailoring instruction to our unique selves would be beneficial, right? That makes sense. And the idea that babies can learn vocabulary through a series of videos, right? All of those things seem very seductive, right? They seem close enough to plausible that they have to be true, right? But when we actually sit down and design scientific experiments with an independent variable and a dependent variable, and we attempt to show causality, we don't really see an effect, right? So that's one reason, is that problem of truthiness, the fact that we tend to accept something as true without searching for scientific validation first. The second reason why we can't rely on our intuition is because of all those pesky heuristics and biases that most of the time help us to avoid overtaxing our cognitive architecture, but can sometimes lead us to the wrong conclusion, right? So we talked about the availability heuristic and the fact that whatever outcome comes to mind the easiest is the one that we deem most likely to occur. We talked about the representative heuristic and how everybody thinks that Jack is an engineer and not a lawyer, and everybody thinks that there's that Steve or whoever it was is a librarian and not a farmer, right? And in making those errors, we're neglecting the base rate, the idea that there are more males who are farmers than there are males who are librarians, and there's more lawyers out there than engineers, right? So yes, so the availability heuristic, the representativeness heuristic, and something called hindsight bias, right? So when we left off last time, I was sharing some interesting psychological studies with you that have been featured and perhaps maligned unfairly in the media, right? So this was a journal article featuring a study, and the title was "Swearing as a Response to Pain." So this was another one that the media sort of liked to cast dispersion about, thinking, of course, this is obvious. We all love to swear. It's cathartic. Obviously, if we're in physical pain, it's going to have analgesic effects in allowing us to experience less of that pain. So how does that relate to hindsight bias, which I'll get to in a moment? Well, I think most people believed about the study. First off, that we were inflicting corporal pain, which the researchers absolutely did not. They used that ice submersion task. So putting your hand in ice water, it's excruciating, but it doesn't actually do any bodily damage to our tissues, right? So that's one misconception, okay? But also, again, the complexity of the study, right? So they had two conditions. They had one condition that both conditions submerged their hand in the ice water, right? So both groups of participants were exposed to the painful stimulus, and half of the participants were encouraged to use profanity, and the other half of the participants were encouraged or instructed to use neutral words. Okay. And so basically, what they were interested in is they were interested in assessing pain outcomes, right? And pain is a very complex variable. So they looked at things like sweating, they looked at increased heart rate and decreased perceived pain, okay, when swearing as compared to when they didn't swear. So I misspoke there. So it was actually a single group of participants, and they looked at their perceived pain level, heart rate, respiration, all of those things, when they used neutral words and when they used swear words. So they were essentially, excuse me, comparing the same group of people at two different points in time, looking at their pain level. And they were also interested in looking at sex differences. So they were interested in looking at how males responded to the manipulation as compared to females. Okay. And what they found is that there were analgesic effects. So their perceived pain as well as their physiological indices of pain were decreased when they looked at pain levels, when they used neutral words versus swear words. They did find a reduction. However, there were interesting sex differences. So males and females showed similar levels of pain reduction, except for men who had a tendency to engage in what's known as catastrophizing. So catastrophizing is essentially a measure of anxiety, or it's an indication of anxiety, and it's basically rumination about the worst possible outcome. So you can imagine, if you're in physical pain, the worst possible outcome might be thinking it's always going to hurt like this. I'm damaging my hand. The pain is never going to go away, etc., etc. And for the participants, primarily males that engaged in this kind of catastrophizing, they showed less pain management when swearing as compared to when they use neutral words. Okay, so again, what is the point? Well, the point is that the media assumes that this was a dumb study to do because the results are obvious. But if we were to ask people to predict results of this study, it's very unlikely that they would have come up with the sort of nuanced answers, that the scientists, that the psychologists conducting the study found, right? So along the same lines, right, the classic demonstration of the hindsight bias is if you were to ask, and this was actually a study that was conducted. So they had participants come into the lab and they told half of the participants that psychologists had confirmed the old adage that absence makes the heart grow fonder. Okay, so they told them, we've confirmed that absence makes the heart grow fonder. If you spend time away from your significant other, your feelings of affection and attachment toward them increase. And then they told another group of participants that the old adage, out of sight, out of mind, is confirmed by psychologists. And the question of interest was, would you have predicted these results, or do these results seem obvious? And unequivocally, the vast majority of participants said, yes, it's obvious. I could have predicted that, right? So this illustrates, right, that our intuitions, which we assume are obvious, are often conflicting, right? And that illustrates the power of hindsight bias, right? So the formal definition of hindsight bias is a cognitive bias in which a person feels that they predicted the outcome of an event, or that they could have predicted the outcome of an event when they did not, right? So it's a cognitive bias in which a person assumes that they predicted or could have predicted the outcome of an event when in fact they did not, right? So I'll give you another example. So in the 1950s and 60s, medical science was really starting to grapple with the really serious consequences of tobacco use. So the higher incidence of lung cancer, throat cancer, mouth cancer, and the fact that nicotine and the associated products that are in tobacco are just really detrimental to health. So they advertised the Surgeon General's warning on cigarettes and all other tobacco products. And there were a lot of people during that time in our history who said, oh, I always knew that. I always knew that smoking was bad for you. I always knew that using tobacco products was a bad idea. But in fact, if you look at our cultural history, right? So if you look at society prior to the Surgeon General's warning, being passed into law for all tobacco products, smoking was everywhere. Anytime, and I'm sure you guys have seen this if you've ever watched like Leave It to Beaver or I Love Lucy or any of those old shows, right? Is people are smoking all the time. It's a very ubiquitous common behavior. It's all over the media. And in fact, for a long time, cigarette companies even advertised to children, and they could go to the store and get candy cigarettes. Okay. So all those people that said, well, I knew it all along that smoking was bad for you. Nothing in our collective history supports the assertion that people could have predicted that, or that they knew it all along, right? So again, hindsight bias is thinking that findings are obvious once you already know the answer. So once you already know the outcome, it's believing that you could have predicted it, or that you knew it all along. Okay. So what other biases do we fall victim to? Well, there's also something known as the confirmation bias. So the confirmation bias is a cognitive bias in which we seek out evidence that confirms what we already believe, thereby strengthening our original belief. Okay, So first I'll give you kind of a generic example, real world example, and then I'll give you an example of how confirmation bias is problematic for psychologists. Okay? So, and I'm certainly guilty of this because I like cracking jokes, but if you believe, right, if it's fundamental to your identity or your self concept that you're a funny person, a humorous person, okay? Then whenever you think about the fact that you're a funny person, or you think back to all of your multitudes of experiences telling jokes, right? What instances are you going to seek out, right? You're going to seek out those instances where you told a joke at Thanksgiving and your little brother laughed so hard that milk came out of his nose, right? So you're going to remember the situations where you were a very effective comedian, right? And you're probably not going to remember that situation where you told the same joke to your grandparents and there were crickets, right? Or maybe you told a different joke and none of your friends thought it was funny, right? So if it is your fundamental belief that you are a funny person with a great sense of humor, then you're going to selectively focus on situations where you told a joke and everybody laughed, right? So now on to how confirmation bias is somewhat problematic for psychologists. So imagine if you are a developmental psychologist and maybe you did your graduate training with somebody that was really, really convinced that aggression is a psychosocial phenomenon, right? So somebody that says kids learn to be physically or verbally aggressive because of society and because of learned influences, right? So kids learn to be aggressive from models like their parents and family members. And they also learn to maybe play violent video games and consume violent media because it's celebrated in our society, right? And so that's your orientation. That's what your training leads you to believe, right? But nothing in psychology is that simple, right? Aggression is a very complicated construct, right? So there's a lot of evidence that aggression is a biopsychological phenomenon, right? So there's all kinds of overactivity in the limbic system. There's fluctuations in testosterone. There's all kinds of things happening in our physiological systems that give rise to aggression, right? So if you have published a lot of research looking at family dynamics and aggression and psychosocial influences, okay, chances are you're going to remember articles, and you're going to seek out articles that confirm that hypothesis and maybe not focus as much or not seek out articles that show kind of the genetic or biological influences for aggression, right? That's confirmation bias. Okay. A related phenomenon is something known as belief perseverance. So with confirmation bias, it refers to the information that you seek out or remember most vividly. Okay, so we seek out and remember information that is confirmatory with respect to our hypothesis, whether it's a scientific hypothesis or just our hypothesis about ourselves, right? Belief perseverance is a situation where you maintain a strong belief despite persistent exposure to contradictory information. Okay, so with confirmation bias, it's just the information that you focus on yourself is confirmatory. With belief perseverance, you continue to maintain the belief, and the belief gets stronger and stronger despite the fact that you're exposed to contradictory information. So I think the example in the textbook that I use was, there were two examples. So one example was global warming, right? So if you happen to believe that climate change is exaggerated or is not an actual phenomenon, right? Despite being exposed to contradictory, overwhelming evidence, right? A lot of people continue to maintain that belief. Okay. Similarly, right? People who are in abusive relationships, right? Whether it be a significant other, a parent, or even just a friend, right? There are people in those situations who continue to believe that their significant other is a good person, has the best of intentions, right? Despite evidence to the contrary. So despite many experiences of physical abuse, emotional abuse, etc., there are people that continue to stay with their significant other despite that contradictory information. And that's an example of belief perseverance. Okay. There's also something known as my side bias. And this is very similar to confirmation bias and belief perseverance. But it's the tendency for people to rate arguments consistent with their beliefs more favorably or more convincing than arguments that contradict their beliefs, right? So for example, this was a very famous study conducted by Lord, who's a social psychologist. And basically, he distributed a questionnaire and he identified one group of participants who were strongly in favor of capital punishment and another group of participants that were strongly against it. Okay. And then each participant in either group was given descriptions of research studies on capital punishment. And some of the studies provided evidence that capital punishment has negative or deleterious consequences. So some of the studies said capital punishment is not a good idea, whereas other studies provided evidence that capital punishment doesn't have any kind of associated cost to it. So when the participants reacted to the studies, their response reflected the attitudes that they had at the beginning of the experiment, right? So for example, an article that showed evidence that supported the disadvantages or flaws of capital punishment was rated as convincing by those against capital punishment, whereas articles that showed no disadvantages to capital punishment were rated as convincing by those who were in support of it, right? So it's very, very similar to confirmation bias. And indeed, you could say my side bias is sort of what is allowing for confirmation bias, right? So not only are people seeking out information that confirms their hypothesis, as is the case with confirmation bias, they're also appraising contradicting information as less valuable or less convincing. Okay. So this is a bias that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with in your daily lives, right? So evidence overwhelmingly indicates that smoking, drinking, and consuming trans fats, right, negatively affects health outcomes, right? There is definitive causal evidence that these behaviors will result in heart attack, stroke, high cholesterol, diabetes, right? But you always have that one person, right? That person who says, my uncle lived to be 92 and he drank and smoked and ate junk food until the day he died, right? So we call those my uncle or my aunt or my cousin stories person who statistics, right? So it's taking into account the experiences of a single individual and assuming that the experiences of a single individual, okay, are more representative or important, presumably, than the experiences of the vast majority of the population, right? So again, evidence overwhelmingly suggests that long-term retention of information is better when you space out your study sessions in time than when you cram them together, right? I have the PhD to prove it, right? This is what my specific research focuses on. But I've always had students that said I crammed for every single chemistry test and now I'm a doctor, right? So it's again, the tendency to overvalue our own experience and those of others and to draw causal inferences from those single cases, okay? And it's also the tendency to favor simple explanations over complicated ones, okay? So let's talk about this again in terms of probability and in terms of statistics, right? Because that's what this class is about, right? So a situation where you have a single individual whose experience differs dramatically from that of most of the population, we would term that single individual as an outlier or as a case that is distinct from the majority of cases, right? And what do we know about statistics? Well, we know that we need a large sample in order to make appropriate inferences, right? So whenever we have a small sample, okay, whenever we have just a few data points, it is far, far, far more likely that those data points are going to be comprised of outliers than of representative cases. Okay, so if we're overweighting the experiences of our own, or if we're overrating our own experience or the experience of one person that we know, right? We're much more likely to be basing our behavior, basing our decision making on an outlier or an uncommon case instead of looking at representative cases, okay? So that's the danger of person who statistics and relying on anecdotal evidence. And anecdotal evidence is just asking people to report on their own experiences rather than looking at something that's been scientifically investigated. When we do that, it's far more likely that we're dealing with an extreme case or an oddball rather than the experiences of the vast majority of people. Okay? Okay, so this concludes our discussion of why we cannot rely on our own intuition. Okay, so now we're moving into the scientific perspective, right? The scientific method, relying on tried and true methods of experimentation and not relying on our intuition, right? So one of the best ways to start talking about science is to talk about the phenomenon of scientific literacy or the construct of scientific literacy. So what is scientific literacy? And by the way, you all are familiar with scientific literacy because you already took a scientific literacy assessment. So you could even tell me the kind of questions, right? The kind of questions that relate to scientific literacy, okay? But our formal definition is simply knowledge and understanding of scientific concepts and processes required for personal decision making, participation in civic and cultural events, and economic productivity, right? So what in the world does that mean? Okay, what it means is scientific literacy is understanding scientific processes or the process of collecting evidence, okay? So understanding how scientists test theories and hypotheses, how they collect observations, and ultimately how those observations and the testing of hypotheses lead to scientific data. Okay, so another way of thinking about it is scientific literacy teaches you to understand how scientists think. Okay, and one of the most important qualities of a scientist is healthy skepticism, right? So instead of accepting something at face value because it seems like it's probably true, right? A scientifically literate person is going to ask, how do we know? Okay, so rather than just deciding that you're going to take a learning style assessment or you're going to take Prevagen supplements to improve your memory, or you're going to put your child with ADHD on a preservative-free diet because you saw it on some talk show, right? Scientifically literate people ask, how do we know that this is an effective intervention, or how do we know that this claim is accurate? And I do want to emphasize with that second bullet point that when we say that scientific literacy is understanding how scientists think, that can be a misnomer. So I'm giving you the exception that proves the rule, perhaps. So John E. Mack is a Harvard-educated psychologist, and he is of the staunch opinion that alien abduction is true. Okay, so he has given several very detailed accounts of alien abduction, and he thinks it's an empirical phenomenon that should be investigated by scientists. Okay, so I'm not going to say anything else about that. You can reach whatever conclusion you like, but just because you're a scientist doesn't mean that all of your ideas are scientific. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So now I have some very exciting data for you as psychology majors that illustrates that psychology is ideal for the development of scientific literacy, right? So here on this graph is showing the number of pages devoted to scientific literacy in introductory textbooks by discipline. Okay, so most introductory biology textbooks have around 6.9 pages devoted to scientific literacy. Chemistry and physics have less than 2 pages of textbooks devoted to scientific literacy. Sociology is doing much better with 12.2, and psychology is way up there with 55.4 pages. Okay, so scientific literacy is one of the most important topics, even at the introductory level for psychology students. Okay. Similarly, we look at scientific literacy scores as a function of the number of psychology classes students have had. So as that number progresses from 0 to more than 6, right? we see a very clear delineated improvement in scientific literacy, right? So that's another data point that suggests that being conversant, being educated about psychology makes you more is a good way of developing scientific literacy. Studying psychology is. Okay. One more, we have scientific literacy scores of psychology students as they progress in the curriculum, right? So we have students' scientific literacy scores as they go from intro to statistics to research methods to advanced research. And we see again a very increasing linear function where we're getting gains upon gains in scientific literacy, right? So you might ask, why is it that psychology is so well purposed to teach the value of scientific literacy? Well, part of it is psychology is a hub science. So when they analyzed over 7,000 journals and over 1 million articles in the social and natural sciences, they found connections between psychology, biology, physics, chemistry, medicine, and neuroscience. So they reasoned that science is critical to other sciences should be cited frequently by other disciplines. And what they found specifically is that scientists from biology, neuroscience, medicine, chemistry, physics cite psychological research in their own work. Okay, so that's what we mean by a hub. Psychology is a hub science because its methods and insights inform numerous other branches of natural science. Another reason why psychology is so well suited for a foundation in scientific literacy is that psychological explanations are generally more complex than those in other fields, just in terms of how many factors have to be considered when explaining even very simplistic behavior, right? So for example, we have to take into account a multitude of different variables. We have to think about gender, age, mood, culture, fatigue, all kinds of things, just to study the simplest and most basic processes related to behavior and mental processes, right? In contrast, explaining the behavior of a chemical compound, right, simply requires knowing the state of one or two variables operating at the same time. So one of the reasons why scientific literacy is so integral to the study of psychology is that we need scientific literacy in order to explain and study the multitude of variables that we look at in a single experiment. Okay, so our last kind of objective here, right? Now that we know the importance of scientific literacy, is to see if we can distinguish between science and pseudoscience, right? So as noted before, sometimes you may hear ideas that sound scientific, but they're really not, right? And in some cases, you might hear a recommendation from a friend about the medicinal properties of essential oils, right? Or a bracelet that can if worn in the correct position, can prevent nausea and motion sickness, right? These are things that are widely propagated in the media and assumed to be true. So it's possible that you get recommendations, not so much out of, malice, but just because people assume, right? It's truthy. It's truthy enough, right? So we accept it as being factual. Okay. But in order to differentiate science from pseudoscience, we need to know the basic properties that characterize the scientific approach. So the most important thing about science is data-driven, right? So we generate ideas and test them by collecting observations or data points. Okay. Once we analyze the data or collect those observations, we generate testable predictions or hypotheses that go beyond what we already know to see if our ideas are sound, right? And the most important component of this data-driven orientation is that we have to show humility, right? We have to be willing to change our ideas if our data doesn't support them, right? We have to modify our hypotheses. So one of the other courses I teach that I'm really passionate about is history of psychology. And one of the sort of classic sayings in early psychology was the rat is always right. Okay. So what does that mean? No matter how badly you want to confirm your hypotheses, no matter how convicted you are about whatever variables you're trying to test and how they'll relate to each other, you always have to go with the data, right? So the rat is always right. The other thing to keep in mind is that science is objective, right? So what do I mean by science is objective, right? So when we conduct a study, we define our ideas clearly enough so that others can understand and evaluate them, right? So in studying people and their behaviors, right, we sometimes need to use measurements that represent a concept because we can't measure that concept directly, right? So for example, if we want to measure how depressed an individual is, we use a standardized test that measures depression, because depression itself is an internal emotional process that we can observe directly, right? And that's probably not like a perfect definition, but it's objective in the sense that outsiders can look at the measurement and understand what's involved and use it themselves, right? So the objectivity of science is exemplified in the fact that we use operational definitions, right? So this is something we'll talk about in our next lecture or in our next topic. But basically, whenever you conduct a psychological study, you have to define your variables in enough detail that looking at those descriptions or definitions, people know exactly how you either manipulated your variable or measured it in enough detail so that they themselves could collect the same measurement or manipulate it in the same way, right? And so that's what we mean by objective. It's definable, it's perceivable, and it can be executed by other scientists and assessed, right? So part of the peer review process, whereby you get your research evaluated by other scientists, is simply looking at your measurements, right? So if I'm trying to assess whether Mercer students are more intelligent than Middle Georgia State students, right? And the way that I'm measuring intelligence is by looking at the circumference of their skulls, right? Then chances are another cognitive psychologist is gonna come along and say, I don't think that is an appropriate method to use to assess intelligence, right? Okay, so another component, and this relates to what we just talked about, is scientific research is verifiable. So what does that mean, right? Well, that means other scientists should be able to conduct your research using those objective definitions to see if your results hold up, right? So sometimes when we replicate a study, we don't see the original results, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that the original results weren't scientific, right? It just means we need more information about why the effect happened in one situation or one laboratory and not another. So this question about how replicable or how reproducible psychology's main findings are came up around 2011 when Brian Nozick initiated what was known as the Replication Project. And so basically, as part of that project, 100 psychological studies were repeated by independent researchers, okay? And 39 of those studies led to the exact same outcome that the original study found, okay? 24 of the studies resulted in similar results that were not quite the same, but very close. And about a little over 30% of the studies resulted in totally different outcomes. Okay, so this caused a surge of criticism of psychology, saying that our results aren't verifiable. They're not replicable. But in fact, when they looked at the studies that hadn't replicated, they found some issues with the research methodology. So, for example, one study that was investigating racial biases against African Americans was attempted to be replicated in Italy, where there's not that sort of long history of racial injustice and systemic racism. So obviously, in a totally different population with a totally different cultural identity, right, or cultural history, we wouldn't necessarily expect those same results. Okay. And it turns out, if we look at the replicability of psychological studies as compared to a lot of medical and cancer and pharmacological research, psychological research is far more consistent and replicable, most notably because some of the nefarious or unethical practices among drug companies, particularly in the United States. So psychology, for the most part, a lot of our most widely cited studies are replicable. And if they're not replicable, there's typically a reason for that, that relates to the soundness of the methodology that's used. Okay. The last thing to note about psychology is, or science rather, is that science is public, right? So researchers must make their findings and their methods available to other scientists who can decide whether the research was carried out effectively or not, right? And it isn't acceptable for a scientist to make a claim, but to refuse to share details of the investigation, right? So this is really a hallmark of pseudoscience, guys, is a refusal to be a refusal to explain how conclusions are reached, right? Or a refusal to be validated or verified publicly. So, for example, there was a very famous magician in the 1960s and 70s known as the Amazing Randy. And he really was a very successful magician, but he was categorically, diametrically opposed to magicians who claimed to have supernatural powers. Okay. So he never claimed in any of his magic acts that he was actually doing magic or actually doing some kind of supernatural phenomenon. And he was very interested, very passionate about cultivating skepticism in America and calling to task people like psychics who claim to have supernatural abilities. And so, one of the things that was really common in the 60s and 70s was for people to claim to have ESP, or to be able to read people's minds, or to be able to detect auras around people and read their energy that way. And so one of the claims that these, charlatans would make is that they see an aura around people. So an aura is just what it sounds like. It's kind of a halo around people, and that they could read it and sort of know their energy. And so the amazing Randy, he devised an experiment to test this assertion. And he said, okay, well, if you can see auras, then I'm going to have this person stand behind a door so that their entire body is covered up. But if they have an aura around their body, you should be able to read it and tell me about this individual. And none of the aura readers would consent to that. And it's because they were not willing to be publicly verified or made public, or they didn't have objective means of assessing their supernatural abilities, right? So the biggest distinction between pseudoscience and science is willingness to have your work verified and scrutinized. Okay, so why am I spending so much time talking about this? Why does scientific literacy matter so much, right? Well, let me tell you guys a story. So this was a case several years ago in Colorado. So a man was on trial for driving while intoxicated. And when the police pulled him over, he had an open can of beer in his lap with his fingerprints on them. He couldn't pass a field sobriety test, so he wasn't able to walk in a straight line, wasn't able to touch his nose or do any of those sort of behavioral tasks. And when they took his blood alcohol level, it was well above the legal limit. Interestingly, though, the jury acquitted him, despite this overwhelming evidence that he was driving under the influence. So why did they acquit him? The judge was astonished by this decision, and they reported that an astrologer on the jury did an astrological reading for the defendant based on his birth date, and found that according to astrological laws, there was no way he could have been drunk that day. The jury believed the argument and acquitted him. Okay. Despite the fact that there are numerous verified public scientific studies that refute the scientific basis, say very confirming evidence that there is no scientific basis to astrology, the jurors still found this very convincing. Okay, so this is obviously an extreme case, but understanding healthy skepticism and being scientifically literate is really, really important for everyday decision making. Okay, medical decision making. So I don't know if I've discussed this in class, but I have a disability. It's a cerebral palsy. It's a movement disorder that results from birth, typically a brain injury that occurs either in utero or shortly after birth, and it leads to a lot of gross motor issues. So most people with CP are in a wheelchair. They use assistive devices. Typically, we have to have lots of different orthopedic surgeries to straighten out our bones and tendons. Sometimes you can have comorbid conditions like seizures. It's the most common cause of childhood disability, right? So obviously, for obvious reasons, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. For obvious reasons, right? People are motivated to research cerebral palsy and come up with good interventions for the treatment of CP. And so when I was a kid, the only treatments that they really had to manage cerebral palsy, there was no cure, were, painful surgeries and leg braces and things like that. And so obviously this was kind of in the heyday of the internet and home computers, or the advent of that. So my mom would log in, via AOL or whatever to do research. Normally she would go to the library, but then we got a computer, and so she would go on the internet for hours, sometimes looking up cerebral palsy and doctors and things. And so there was something called the Adeli suit. And so the Adeli suit was a full body apparatus that your child would wear. And it was basically a suit made out of wires. And what the creators of the Adeli suit said is that if you hold your child's hands and have them walk with this magic Adeli suit, the wires and the electricity connected via these fibers would stimulate your child's muscles. And so they had very, very active advertising campaigns, and they were pretty much everywhere on the internet. This was during the days of message boards and forums. So they would target forums where people, had disabled children, and they would say, if you want your child to walk again, you need to come to our clinic, and you need to come to our clinic and get an Adeli suit. And so my mom, who was not a scientist, she graduated high school, but she didn't have any sort of college degree. She was a skeptic, and so she was. You can actually belong to skeptic societies. The amazing Randy was one of the people that founded the Skeptical Society. And the Skeptical Society is basically founded on the principle that you should be skeptical of a lot of different claims. And so my mom, even though she wasn't a doctor, or somebody with an advanced degree, she knew science. She knew scientific literacy. She had a healthy skepticism, and she knew that before taking me, God knows where, and paying thousands of dollars in the early 90s for this magic Adeli suit, she had to know whether it was effective. And so, she went and she looked at various websites, looked up articles on the internet, and found that there was absolutely no scientific evidence to support the effectiveness of this Adeli suit. And when she took, these articles, printed them out and took them to my doctors, they confirmed it. Again, there's absolutely no evidence in support of this Adeli suit. And despite knowing that, she was still being heavily marketed to. She was still seeing ads and videos basically showing pictures of kids with CP and promising things like, watch your child walk again. It's a miracle. You'll be amazed, et cetera, et cetera. And years later, I went to a disabled camp, or a camp for disabled kids. And one of the kids there that I was friends with, her mom and dad were going to pay, I think it was like $15,000 or something, to go to Poland to have her do this Adeli suit program. And my mom tried everything she could. She talked to her for 3 hours in a parking lot, trying to convince her that it wasn't effective. And showing her, even though my mom didn't really understand what the scientific method was, she knew what data was. And sadly, she didn't convince her until my friend Laura got this Adeli suit that did nothing for her. But yeah, so what does that story have to do? Why am I telling that story? Because in the context of a college classroom, right, you might not think that thinking about scientific literacy really matters beyond an exam or an assessment or a paper. But being scientifically literate and understanding how to distinguish science from pseudoscience and fact from fiction, that ability is going to serve you all throughout your life, whether it's medical decision making or decision making about the products that you're going to buy, the decision making about the food that you're going to eat, right? It all matters in a very real world and urgent way. Okay. So I hope this video was helpful to you. Again, I apologize that I couldn't be there in person today, but I will be there on Wednesday for lab. And I look forward to seeing all of you, and I hope you have a great day. Take care.